All right. And we are live, and we're going to let some attendees come streaming in. All right. Folks are coming in. Hello, welcome. Okay.
The only weird part is they can see us and we can't see them.
Yes, we are being observed.
I've done a lot of Zoom calls, but I haven't done one of these on the panelist side, only on the other side.
Oh, where we've been in a meeting. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Welcome to everyone that's coming in. We'll give just like a minute or so for people to stream in before we start things off. But it's so lovely to see so many names streaming through. I hope that everyone has been having a decent quarantine week. Everybody is safe and healthy and, able to get outside a little bit. Maybe do a little bit of exercise, walking, um, stare lovingly at dogs across the street as you go on a walk, which is what I do because I miss petting dogs. But welcome everyone to tonight's event. My name is Lee. I'm the museum operations manager at the GLBT Historical Society, which means I run all of the operations and facilities of the museum, as well as curate the programs. So tonight we are going to be having a wonderful conversation between Eric Watt and Daniel Bao. And I'm just going to preface this a little bit with some housekeeping and showing you how you can utilize the different options that are available to you as a webinar attendee, and then I will introduce Eric and we'll get started. So for tonight, as an attendee, you have 3 different options for ways that you can engage with us and with the content and with each other. There should be a chat box that you have access to. If you open that up, you can write in the chat. I can already see some people are writing in there. And you can you have the option of sending a message to all the panelists, which is me, Daniel, and Eric, or you can send a message to everyone. If you want it to be a comment that everyone can see, please make sure in the little to drop down, you select everyone. Otherwise, the message will only go to us. So thank you for your lovely messages that you have sent so far, but no one else can see them if you want them to be seen. Please feel free to talk amongst yourselves during the presentation. If you have things you want to chat about or comment on, we'll be looking at the chat, and that brings us to the next option for engagement, which is the Q&A. So after we're through with the main conversation, we'll move into a question and answer section, and Eric will be answering your questions and kind of sparking some discussion among the audience. There is a Q&A function that looks like the chat box, but there's 2 of them in conversation. Please feel free to send questions in through that. You can type them and then we'll select them for answering when we get to the Q&A. Please feel free to send them in throughout the entire evening. You don't have to wait until the end if you feel like you're gonna forget the question. And then lastly, you have the little raise hand option. If you click that button, that will show me that you have something you'd like to contribute. So if you have something that you would like to say verbally, or you don't feel comfortable writing the question in the question and answer function, you can select that button and that will tell me that you want to talk, and I can unmute you and you can join the conversation during the Q&A if you'd like to do it that way. I also want to give just a brief disclaimer that tonight's event will feature some explicit images. So if that's something that you are not about, just letting you know, we're going to be featuring some visuals. And with that, I would like to introduce our host tonight, who is Eric C. Watt. He has been active in struggles for LGBT, immigrant, and workers' rights for more than 2 decades. His short stories and essays have appeared in various anthologies and journals. He is the author of the Making of the Gay Asian Community, an oral history of pre-AIDS Los Angeles, and is currently working on a follow-up book on AIDS activism in the Asian Pacific Islander communities. Tonight, we're going to be talking about Swim, which is his debut novel, and he lives and writes in Los Angeles. Thank you so much, Eric.
So excited. Are you going to introduce Daniel too?
I can introduce Daniel, or I didn't know if you wanted to.
I'll let you do the official introduction.
Okay, I'll introduce Daniel. I know Daniel very well. Daniel
My coworker.
is so Daniel Bao began his AIDS work in 1986 with the Stanford AIDS Education Project, one of the first student-run AIDS organizations. After graduation, he organized National Condom Week every February 14th to 21st. Nice way to kick off Valentine's Day. And worked at the Gay Asian Pacific Alliance Community HIV Project, providing technical assistance to Asian and Pacific Islander HIV organizations, as well as LGBTQ API groups throughout the US. Daniel now consults in finance with various nonprofits and is currently the finance director at the Society. So, hello. I saw you earlier this week. So yeah, take it away, Eric. I'm gonna disappear into the background, but if anyone has any questions, I'm still here.
Thank you, Lee. My informal introduction of Daniel is, well, I knew Daniel for a while, back in the 90s, right?
Back in the 90s, yes.
Back in the 90s. And when I started this project around doing AIDS movement history, everyone said, you have to talk to Daniel. You have to talk to Daniel. And I said, I know I have to talk to Daniel. But I'm focusing on LA.
LA.
I was focusing on Los Angeles because I know San Francisco is a different animal. And I know LA. I don't know San Francisco.
There's New York, there's Chicago, there's Boston, there's Philadelphia, there's lots, Honolulu, Seattle, Washington, lots of places.
So I haven't talked to Daniel until tonight. So I'm very excited about this conversation. You know, he's going to tell me what I get wrong.
Nah.
So I just want to set up set the scene, I guess, for tonight before this conversation with Daniel. When Lee approached me earlier this year, before COVID-19, and said, "What do you want to talk about? You know, what do you want to focus on with your book?" At that time, we thought we were still going to do it in Castro, and I was like, "I have to talk about sex in Castro. If I can't talk about sex in Castro, there's no way that I can talk about sex anywhere else." You know, so unfortunately, I'm still not doing an event at the museum, which is sort of a little dream of mine. I've done research for my first book there, but that will happen later on. But I'm also glad that they decided to keep this event and do it through online, so everyone else could also attend. So I see this event sort of a bridge between my novel Swim and my current work around the API AIDS movement in Los Angeles. I'm calling this sex positive. And you'll know why a little bit later. And the impetus for this was when my publisher accepted the novel, and they were great. They are like this 80-year-old couple, white couple from upstate New York. No, I'm sorry, not upstate, Long Island, New York. And they loved the book. They thought it was raw. They thought it was honest. They thought it was kind of funny, but also brutal. And I love that they used all those adjectives because that was my intention for the book as well. But the wife, the woman, the wife of the pair who was working with me more on the content, on the editing, she said that, but in this chapter, there's too much nipple. And I was like, I kind of kept the nipple low, the nipple count really low in this book. I mean, there is a lot more nipple if I want to do the way I wanted to do it, right? So kind of made me think about, oh, maybe I'm a little bit too explicit. But I fought for it. It's like, you know, like I think it's just the right amount of nipple. So can we keep that? And she said, yes, it's all up to you. I'm just saying, like, this is what I thought.
I think that's a name, that's a title for your autobiography.
Too much nipple?
No, just enough nipple, the right amount of nipple.
Yes. So, and then when I started doing readings, when the book came out, I started doing readings. I have to select which section to read in public. And I couldn't read chapter 1 because chapter 1 had the most sex in it. You know, I'm trying to get people's attention. Back in the old days when people go to the bookstore and buy books, they would flip through the novel, right? So if the first chapter is interesting and it's titillating, they might then keep reading. So you put all the good stuff in chapter 1. I mean, the rest of the book is good too, but that kind of good stuff you put in chapter 1. So I couldn't read chapter 1 because at my launch event, my parents were there. So I was like, no, I'm not gonna read about sex. At another event in the bookstore in Pasadena, the reading area was right next to the children's book area. So in the contract they signed with you, they explicitly said that certain things that you cannot read because parents and kids are roaming around the bookstore and might hear certain things, right? So, and then that again brought up this idea of like, maybe I'm writing sex too explicitly. Like, why am I such a slut? And then when I was doing the API AIDS movement history, I realized why I am that way. I was influenced by the activists that kind of schooled me on AIDS education. And I have no idea. I mean, I kind of have an idea, but it really reinforced for me how much my outlook on sex is informed by that era, by how people talked about sex in my community, So I wanted to, Daniel, to speak on that a little bit later, but that's all of the setup for this. I do want to read a little bit from the book, not a lot, and I'm not going to read it actually. There's an audio book and it's being narrated by, I'm glad they got an Asian American actor to do it. His name is Theodore Chen. I think he's San Francisco based. So I'm going to play chapter 1 with sex in it. So just a little bit disclaimer, this is the graphic part, and this is by no means the most graphic part of this hour. But I just want to let you know that there's some text around sex and drugs in this passage that I'm going to share with you. And this is the chapter 1. So the story is this guy, the protagonist, woke up from the drug binge to find out that his mother has passed away. And he is on his way back to his parents, to kind of handle all the stuff that his mom would handle. But he had to make a detour to see his ex. So this is the second half of the chapter 1, and I am going to do this. Okay.
I met Jeremy in 2008 during the writer's strike. He was a TV cameraman, so he was de facto unemployed and had time on his hands. He found me online and asked if I partied. He'd been working on a critically acclaimed but low-rated TV show that had managed to limp from the second season to a half-season renewal before the strike hit. He'd used occasionally, most of the time just to stay awake on long days of shooting and sometimes for sex. Then he had no work and too much free time. He told me he lived by the ocean, and he's Chinese like me. But unlike me, he was American-born and tall, 6'1". I told him that I'd used other stuff, but not meth, and I was willing to drive to Santa Monica and experiment. He taught me how to smoke. He fed me hit after hit, and we made out, tumbling through his apartment. When the meth hit me, it tingled my brain like a breeze through chimes. I swore I could hear it too. I pushed him so he lay flat on his floor, and I got on top of him. He twisted both my nipples like they were dials on a safe. He had a grin on his face because I think he saw how high I was getting. I rode him, but his dick wasn't hard. He said it wasn't going to get hard that way, and I had to suck him. I did. We fucked. We fucked in his room. We fucked sideways on his couch so we could watch porn together. He fucked me from behind in his pantry. It was dark. I was holding on to the shelves and could hear cans rattling. Everything could have fallen down, and I couldn't care less. At 3 a.m., he took me to the landing just outside his apartment and fucked me on the cold concrete. He positioned me so I could see his neighbor's door and keep watch. He said dark things that excited me. The best part came a couple hours later. He led me to the roof of his complex. We squeezed into one of the deck chairs. We groped and made out with the sunrise. Eventually the sun overpowered the clouds and revealed the pedestrian grids to our east like dirty mazes. I turned away to face Jeremy. Looking west, I slipped my legs, one at a time, next to either side of his hips. He locked me in with his arms. Cock to cock, I rested my chin on his shoulder and looked on the Pacific as the ocean lost its glisten before my eyes and turned into dark, velvety ribbons. I'm now fourth in line, and I find myself caressing my left nipple under my shirt. Fuck. I've not come here to reminisce. He sees me now. I can tell by his face. He loses that customer service expression. He turns and leans into the hissing machine that's frothing the latte. I'm third in line. That first come down with Jeremy was the worst. I drove back home fine, but as soon as I stepped out of the car, I blacked out. My fall woke me, so it was just for a second. I had to lean against the car door for another minute before I wanted to get up. Later, in my apartment, I felt like there was a hole in the roof of my mouth. I felt someone had pulled out my tonsils and stuffed them back willy-nilly. My body was cold to the touch, but I knew I was heating up. I couldn't sleep. I kept touching myself even though it started to hurt, like I'm doing now. Reluctantly, I called Jeremy. I was on the phone with him on the bathroom floor over the toilet because I felt like I could throw up any minute, even though my stomach was as hard as a rock. He talked me down. I started crying. He kept being patient with me. He didn't freak out or hang up. In fact, an hour later, he showed up at my door. We cuddled. We were naked only because we were both hot and sweating. We held each other like that for a few hours before I finally fell asleep. He tells Screechy Girl, "Give me a sec." I'm close enough to hear that. He leaves his station and pulls me out to the side, by the community board and away from everyone else. A poster of dark hands sorting coffee berries hangs above us. His back is to his crew, so they can't tell what he's saying. "What the hell are you doing here?" I haven't figured out what to say. The only thing I can think of is, "I'm sorry." I shrink always in his presence, whether when we are lying down in a cuddle or when we're standing like we are now. Jesus Christ, are you high now? My mother, she passed away last night. I say it partly to divert the accusation. What? My mother is dead. My eyes are hotter than the rest of my body. My mother is dead. I say it again, louder. The whole lobby could hear me. I have to leave now. I know why I needed to tell him that. I rush past the new line of customers and out the door. I'm sobbing, the ugly kind of sobbing that you don't even try to wipe away because it keeps coming. You just let it leak from your chin. Remember to breathe, he had told me when he first fucked me, and he told me again on the phone the day after. Damn good advice everywhere you go. Every time I inhale, my body shakes. My nose, my throat, my shoulder, down to my knees. He's seen me weak ever since I called him the day after our first time, but I still can't stand him seeing me like this. I back out without looking. The swaying palm fronds recede from my windshield, and it's still a cloudy sky, no sign of the sun. My mother is dead. My mother is dead. I stop to wait for the tremors to quiet. They don't, and I have to go. Chapter.
So that was the first chapter, end of the first chapter. So I want to share that, but I also want to get into the conversation about how, I think on Facebook I said how AIDS movement liberated us from, gave us a more liberated view about sex, you know. So, but I know, Daniel, you wanted to ask me a question. I have a question for you too. But
who should start? Maybe I'll start. Well, you know, for me, I think one of the hardest things for historians is once you pass like 25 years, I was joking, you know, you pass from gossip to history, right? And then what's difficult is you have to then try to set up, a time period in which a lot of people, weren't adults or don't remember. And I was wondering how you do that. You know, it's different when you wrote a history versus a novel. How much of it do you feel you have to explain, and how much of it are you just letting it, doing it as a sort of period piece?
the history or the novel?
Well, both. I want to see how, did you take different approaches?
Yeah, it's almost like it's kind of thing that you do without thinking too much about it, right? It's like if you think too much about it, then you get paralyzed in a way. I'll talk about the history first. I think my approach is I see the history as storytelling. More than a documentation or in the academic kind of way, right? Like I think it kind of fits what the activists were doing as well. I wouldn't want to tell the story in a way that sterilized the language, for example. So you talk about gossip. I felt like, some of it is gossip, some of it is community building, right?
Hey, it's both.
It's both. Gossip.
The old joke, what's the difference between gossip and history? It's like 30 years, right?
Yeah, that mark.
Any difference.
Yeah. So, and so I felt like it's like piecing different things together. It's kind of wonderful when it's almost like being a detective. Someone talk about something that happened, and then someone said, "Oh, I was at that meeting," and then all of a sudden it's like, "Oh, now I have corroboration." There was one incident that I had the hardest time writing about because people disagree about what happened.
Rashomon. Was it a Rashomon thing?
Describes the Rashomon, right? And it was kind of really intense. It was, I don't know if you were there actually.
Oh.
It was a fundraiser at Circus Disco the night before in the National API HIV conference that APAIT, the Asian Pacific AIDS Intervention Team, was hosting with NMAC, the National Minority AIDS Coalition.
My staff was there. I believe Prescott and Kenji Oshima, Prescott Chow and Kenji Oshima, I believe told me about it, but I think I was not actually there that night.
So there was a sketch.
An incident, yes.
There was an incident. There was
an incident
during the fundraiser. It was done by, it was a drag performance, and it's an Asian drag queen who impersonated Tina Turner. That was 1993, I believe.
Yes, I remember well the story. Yes, not just Tina Turner, aspects of her personal life, right?
So they were reenacting the scene where Ike was beating Tina Turner, and they were doing a comedic kind of way, which pretty horrendous. And there was a lot of finger pointing. The person who was so in the center of the storm has passed away. And I also had a relationship with this person in other contexts much later, and I did like that person too. So I had a hard time. I want to tell the truth, but I also want to give him, a certain space to, like, there might be some transformation that I'm not aware of since that time too. So I don't want to cast, so there's a lot of like.
Well, I could see that Prescott was there, as I remember. Cesar Cadavis was there. Boon Nguyen were there. You have a lot of people to get more stories from.
Yeah. So anyway, so that's, to me, it's sort of like, and I realized that my job is not to get it right. My job is to say, like, this is what some people thought. This is what a lot of people thought, and that in itself is the story, right?
Yeah.
So I don't feel the pressure of saying, no, that person was wrong. That person was blah, blah, blah,
Well, it's also, something happened, but the important thing was the response, right? That's really what sort of altered history or altered events afterwards. That's just sort of the way, because often it's not, ironically enough, it's not necessarily always exactly what happened. It's what people remembered, right? About a particular event. Like, people remember that part, but nobody ever told me the rest of the show, right? I mean, let's see, Vince Corsasimo also was there, so maybe they remember the rest of the show, but I think that was the most memorable part, right?
You'll save a lot of time for discussion with the audience too. But I was also going to say that, like, I would approach it from a more of a restorative justice angle. Like, what can we learn? What can we do about it? It's not about, like, placing blame. It's not about someone is right, someone is wrong, but what is it that we want to learn from that experience, right? So I didn't let that answer your question. Did I just?
Yeah, I think so. I was just trying to get start the conversation a little bit on history and how far you go and how you set context with different genres, right?
Right. Yeah, yeah.
novel between history. I mean, I could imagine the publishers with your novel ever say, I mean, they said too much nipple. Did they say too much history? Or did they say you have to give people more context, or this doesn't make sense right now?
For the novel, no,
Mhm.
there's not that
No?
much history in the novel. You know, it's kind of more personal than anything else. Yeah, but I was going to talk about sex.
Okay, let's talk about sex.
But before we talk about AIDS and sex, I felt like we need to discuss why, like, sort of our attitude towards sex, like around the time of the epidemic, the AIDS epidemic, was so fucked up, right? You know, so I'm thinking about, like, you actually have to go back to the time, like in the 70s, right, when there's a sexual revolution, when there's an anti-war movement, everything is being under scrutiny, like everything that has been considered establishment, authority, that we take for granted, businesses, government, religion, all of that is under attack, right?
Mhm.
You have all the race-based movements, you have the feminist movement, you have the anti-war movement, but it's also like
Modern GLBT movement.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then you have so the modern GLBT movement started in 1969.
And obviously we say modern because there was a 1950s homophile movement, right? There were previous ones, but modern meaning, I think, post 65. That's the way I think of it.
Yeah, yeah. I put, like, so you even put it a little bit before Stonewall.
Oh yeah, well, because for Asians, right, I would think of 1965, the Immigration Act, and that really changed the. I mean, obviously there were, Asia. What we would now. I mean, they weren't really Asian then, right? There were Chinese American movements, and there were people who were doing a lot of work, especially in Hawaii. But 65 really changed things in terms of the number of immigrants that could come in, right? You weren't stuck and limited by the 1924 numbers, right? You had
Yeah,
a huge influx of people coming in.
yeah. So the pan-ethnic idea, the political identity of Asian American and later Asian Pacific Islander,
Yeah.
hasn't really started until around the mid to late 60s too. And
I think you need enough people to. There is something very. I tend to do a little bit of a structural analysis, so I think you need a sort of enough people, right? You need a minimum number to incite things, to create things, to have enough GLBT APIs.
right.
And do
It's important because it kind of changes the makeup of the Asian populations in the U.S. Right,
Mhm.
became much more immigrant.
Yes, and then eventually much less Chinese and Japanese, right?
Right.
Which was and then Filipino in Hawaii. That was historical. Yeah.
And then the 70s happened, and because of the American war in Southeast Asia, then you have the influx of the Southeast Asian refugees, which again complicated the identity that wasn't so new to begin with, right? So the idea that you can be queer and API kind of took a while to happen, yeah?
I think so. I mean, obviously there were queer, what we would consider queer APIs before. I mean, obviously history, but even like I would think, Magnus Hirschfeld's surviving lover was Chinese. He met him in Asia in the 1920s, and was there until through his death in the 1930s. The Daughters of Bilitis, the first American lesbian group, was inspired by a Filipino lesbian who wanted a place to dance.
Right. So the GLBT API organizing started what, late 70s?
Actually, the earliest group I have a record of is 76.
76.
Gay Asian Support Group in San Francisco. Tamara Ching and a few other people are still around from that time period.
Right. And then AIDS hit, right?
And yeah. And interestingly, I sort of think 65, 76, and then 86, 87, Asian AIDS Project and APAIT, START, 89, Apacha, New York, and GCHIP, START. So a lot of things, they're a little artificial to look at time periods, but a little, decades.
Right. I think there's a pattern, right? There's a reason why things only happen at that time.
I think part of it is, yes. I mean, there's both a pattern. I mean, individuals, I think, are important. And we can talk about, I think so, there are some cities that because you had leadership, you had more activism than you might think of, given the absolute number of Asian Pacific Islanders who lived in the particular city. And there are probably some cities where there was less. But you had to have a core number, I think,
Right.
to have enough people who felt that they were partially aggrieved. I mean, there was a reason, there was sort of negative and a positive reason to do the organizing. I think part of it was because, a lot of Asians felt that in the sort of mainstream modern, that was then the gay movement, they weren't necessarily treated that well, right? That they couldn't get, the famous thing of the 4 IDs required for Asians in gay bars in San Francisco.
Right.
And of course, it leads to other issues then, because it also became pretty obvious that the men were pretty sexist. So in the 70s, so a lot of Asian lesbian groups then started in the late 70s, early 80s for that reason, when they didn't feel like, I think they had the most welcoming home in the first sort of gay Asian groups, which actually, interesting enough, if you look at a lot of the ideology behind them, tended to portray themselves as sort of pan-Asian American, and like all gender groups.
Right.
And then and then you saw further sort of separation splits in the 80s, 90s, South Asian movement, Asian lesbian movement, Pacific Islander, and then in particular cities like LA, you had specific Chinese groups and Korean groups and Vietnamese groups and Filipino groups, and so
Yeah. So and how many of those groups are Asian and Friends group in the beginning?
Yes, also I forgot to mention, Asian and Friends groups start also in the 80s, after that, in the late 70s, early 80s, after that split from the mid 70s, because the first Asian groups did think of themselves not only as pan-Asian but also pan-ethnic, and they wanted non-Asian supporters.
Right. So you have like this sense of sexual freedom in the 70s and early 80s too, I would say. People were going to clubs, people were experimenting with non-monogamous, polyamorous kind of relationship. We talk about that now, but people were doing that, open relationships, right?
There were some new drugs on the market,
Market, and you
no
don't have
disco.
You don't have marriage at the time, so why abide by the traditional institution that was under attack anyway, right? So sex was kind of wonderful. People experimenting with kink, and drugs. Drugs is a big part of it, which is why it's also a big part of the novel too. I would often say, I wouldn't be doing drug if it wasn't related to sex. I just didn't see, So and there's
I always said in the 80s, I always thought alcohol was the perfect gay drug, right? Because it loosened you up. This is before the harder drugs, and it encouraged having sex and feeling like the world was open.
And then AIDS came along, and not just AIDS, but also the political times, right? We have the rise of Reaganism.
The backlash, preppies, yuppies, Reagan,
Right. Yeah, you have everything is being walked back, all the sexual liberation being walked back, and AIDS came along, and it's all of a sudden people who have been out or people who were out went back into the closet because they don't want to be associated with. Well, I mean, there's this conflation of AIDS and homosexuality.
That's right. Yeah.
So, if people know that you're gay, they just think you have AIDS. So
yeah. In fact, when I first started doing work at Stanford at school, I did. I was sort of one of the things I didn't like is I'd seen some presentations by the Contraceptive Counseling Center, and they sort of view things as very, they pushed a lot of numbers. Everything was a percentage. They managed to make sex boring, which I always found fascinating, how you managed to do that. A real skill. So we tried to do something that was, we call them rubberware parties, sort of as a takeoff on Tupperware parties. But I remember trying, an early version of it I was a freshman, on another friend of mine who was gay. Actually, he was bi and a bit closeted. And he told me, Daniel, I don't think you should be doing this. I'm like, how come? And he goes, well, everyone will think you have it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was sort of the atmosphere. Why are you jeopardizing your future, for this?
So talk about boring sex. So I came to this
boring sex, yes.
To start boring sex first. When I came to this country when I was 11.
Okay.
I was almost 12, 1982. So that was sort of the beginning of AIDS. I became politically conscious in college around the early 90s.
I'm just a few years ahead of you.
Yes.
I came in 74, 75 when I was 8,
Right.
and became politically conscious in the 80s in college. So
AIDS has always been a backdrop, right? So when I was a teenager learning,
yeah, got it. Yeah.
sex education was hella boring. It was like,
Well, that was that they were pushing abstinence in those days, right? Yeah.
well, they were putting condom on bananas. Well, actually, let me take this back. I went to a Catholic school, so my sex education
Yes.
was a movie about an actual abortion.
A little story from my condom education days. I was doing National Condom Week. I get a call, I still remember, from Anna Maria College or something in Massachusetts. And the lady says, I love your stuff, but do you have anything that doesn't have the word condom on it? And I said, we're the Condom Resource Center. We do National Condom Week. No, but I can print up these little stickers that say Pope John Paul II, and you can stick them over any offending word. And she was like, and it was me in my 20s, and she goes, I don't find that a very helpful suggestion. I'm like, sorry, not much I can do to help, good luck.
And I've
Anyway,
gone to AIDS 101 workshop. I've done AIDS 101 workshop
Yes.
where it's like really boring and technical. What are the 4 ways to transmit to be transmitted? Here's a banana. Here's slip of a condom.
At least you got that far.
If you do it without a condom, you'll die, kind of thing.
Oh, that, yeah.
It scared the shit out of me as a young person, right?
Well,
like,
that was the idea early on, right? Scare people.
Right.
Stop doing it. AIDS is death. Death is bad. Don't do it. Or sex equals AIDS. AIDS equals death. Death is bad. Don't do sex. Yeah.
So the people that I talked to for the history book, they felt like that was AIDS in some way as a betrayal of all these wonderful things that were promised to them.
Got it. Yeah.
Right. That a lot of them were scared into not doing anything. And they kind of missed out in a certain kind of period, right? Like, so, and I felt that way too. Like I didn't really became sexually active until my 20s, well after college. So I missed the whole college years.
Oh, I got college in at least, but I understand. I mean, Randy Kikukawa, who was also in the, I don't think he's on, but he's an early gay Asian activist. He did the famous protest against the 4 IDs in San Francisco. He would tell me stories about the 70s, about people having vans, taking a van to work and having sex during lunchtime, or just someone giving a blowjob in the middle of Castro Street at night, though, when it was a little dark. And I was like, wow, that is just, like I couldn't quite imagine it.
Yeah. So the API activists that again ruined me as a writer, because at that time a lot of them were writers, a lot of them were artists.
Oh yeah.
It was not a career that pays a lot.
Well, because there's a stigma, right? This was before professionalization. So you'd expect people to have MSWs or MPHs. The first MPH I remember was actually probably Javed Syed in New York. But yeah, now I see Caesar. I remember Caesar once printed up a little card that said HSG after his name. I'm like, what does that stand for? And it was like high school graduate. Or John Manzon Santos, an Italian major. I did Latin American studies. If Steve Liu was a printmaker, that's the kind of training we had. So for better, for worse.
It's important because AIDS movement, it's a movement in cultural productions too, right? I mean, it's not just a policy-driven movement. It's actually a culture change movement, and they do culture change through a lot of these creative activities.
That was the intent, right? Because, if we sat back and waited for, about saving face and about not rocking the boat and being quiet, what would that do?
Yeah. So during that period, so these AIDS activists would do these writers group, right? And they would gather people like me, and later on I would sort of replicate that too. But they see that as HIV prevention, like bringing in this case, I think in the group that at least I belong to were gay Asian men, no women. But in any case, that they see that as HIV prevention, as a way to sort of build up your identity.
Sure, self-esteem. I mean, what did you see?
So
I mean, there was no gay Asian LGBT API representation. There wasn't even much positive LGBT representation. I remember someone in the 80s complaining that when he was growing up, he like had a crush on James Bond or something, and he thought it was so homophobic of him. And I said, what else, who else did you have to look up to in those days?
So I want to show this to the
Yes.
folks, right? So
Can we give a warning now?
social marketing.
We want to give the warning though.
Oh, not yet.
Oh, not yet. Okay, too bad. Okay, eventually we can give a warning.
Yeah, let's give people warning.
Okay.
The social marketing is huge, right? Because especially in immigrant communities, especially in communities of color, who is not like, used to talking about sex, or supposedly not used to talking about sex, or like talking about sex and death, you have to kind of grab their attention. So a lot of these marketing materials are very sexy, right? They actually try to portray. I said that they try to reclaim sex for the community. So make it fun, make it exciting.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all about harm reduction, like make informed choices, know what your risks are, but you shouldn't like deny yourself pleasure, your sexual being, because of this epidemic. Like we're not going down that easy, right? And they kind of showed in some of the messages that they portrayed, right? My friend Deep would tell this story about when she was doing a HIV workshop, that she would use a lot of sex toys, dildos and nipple clamps, like make it interesting. Talk about role play, talk about kinks. Like if you have penetration without a condom, you can do other things that make it really pleasurable too. So that's a huge part of reclaiming sex, right?
Yeah, the biggest sex organ, right? Your brain. That's what we always said.
Right. So I mean, that's the point of, in a way that it's not retreating because of the epidemic, but actually doubling down on how freaky we could be, right? So one of the campaign that came out in 1992 or 93, I don't remember. It's called Love Your Asian Body. It was actually the first social marketing campaign that
92.
92, the fall of, I think, again, towards the end of 92.
Yeah, mid to late 92, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so it was Asian Pacific AIDS Intervention Team in LA, the first social marketing campaign. And this is the first time, at least in that city, where you see this kind of Asian images, erotic images, right? That's
note that it's in black and white because it was too expensive to do color. But
so I am going to play something. This is Rick Parrish.
Ah, Rick.
Oh, did I?
One of the co-founders of APIT, right?
Co-founder of APIT, and this is him talking about how he came up. He helped come up with that slogan, "Love Your Asian Body." So
we were at a coffee house in West Hollywood, and there was this young Asian guy. He was sitting there, and we were all talking, and we were kind of like boy watching. The guys walking by, and this Asian kid, he goes, I wish my nose wasn't so flat. And my colleague Joel Tan, he goes, honey, love your Asian body. We're going to use that. And just the whole idea of how in Western culture, the most, what is defined as beauty, and especially in the gay men's culture, usually you see these blonde-haired, blue-eyed type, I don't know, Nordic gods as the height of beauty, when in fact, we're all beautiful. So part of our campaign was to emphasize the fact that taking care of your body and loving your body and having self-esteem, that's part of having a healthy self-image. And so we were promoting healthy self-image. We were promoting loving our bodies as they are. And part of that love is to get tested so that we will know what to do if in fact we're positive. We did a photo shoot in my apartment, and we had these two guys, Eric Reyes and Keith Kasai. They were our models. And so we took pictures of them in very intimate situations. And we never saw images of gay Asian men together. They were always with a white guy or with another race or something, but never us together. So that was in a way that was very revolutionary to even create these images, especially in a time where people were very conservative about sexuality and also afraid about sexuality. So we were probably the only organization that was actively producing erotic images of gay Asian men together.
And what was the response, as far as you knew, to this campaign?
It was mixed. Some people loved it. They absolutely loved it. And some people hated it. And we were accused by some as being reverse racist.
Yeah, what does that mean that you were being reverse racist in this campaign?
Well, I can only assume what it meant because it came from some white gay men that were, they had Asian partners, but they didn't like the fact that we were empowering their partners to speak up for themselves and to give themselves a voice. It was a novel concept, because there was an old school idea among a lot of gay Asian men that, the best thing you could hope for is to get a white lover, which to me was so self-defeating. It's like there's nothing wrong with having a white lover, but the context in which they were framing it was actually quite nauseating.
So, did you see the picture I put up for Rick and Joelle?
Yeah, I see it right now. Yeah, those are the old the sticky war years, as it were. Yeah, and sticky was a controversial political position.
Right. So, so that was sort of like why I think about sex in the way that I think about it, right? Because there's a lot of influence, and what APIT did was not so unique in a way, right? Because this is where the trigger warning is going to happen.
Trigger warning.
I'm sorry. Viewer discretion advice. So we're going to show some dick pics from back in the days, right?
Shocking.
Yeah, so I asked Daniel before, like last week, I said, like, I really want to look for the smut issue of Lavender Godzilla. Do you have a copy of it? Like, can we do something? And then Daniel said, not only do I have a copy of it, but the archives, the Historical Society actually scanned it.
Available.
Yeah, he sent it to me in a PDF like 5 minutes later. Which I told Daniel that like I actually got up from my chair, did a little dance.
I asked for the dance, but Eric refused to perform it for me. So we're gonna have to have a request for it from the participants.
Let's keep that sexy.
Love your Asian body.
I love your Asian body. So anyway, let me share this. I want to share this because I felt like there's this sort of conversation that's happening not only in LA, but there's a lot
in other parts of the country. Yeah.
Right? You want to talk a little bit about the issue since you worked on it?
Well, I was only the business person on it. I had no part of the editorial content. But we should credit the people. I think there's a list of people who worked on it. Francisco Matos, Prescott Chow. Who else is on that list? Jesse, I think, was on there when he was using a different name. James Lee, Maurice, James Tran, there. Oh, Prescott, good. Prescott is letting us know. See, he was there. Of course, the question was always, who is on the cover? And are those two different parts?
And there's conversation between LA and San Francisco too, right? Because this picture.
Yes, we reproduce that from LA. Yeah. There's a list. Justin Prescott, you can read it. Yeah.
Vince, Dino.
Craig, yeah.
Francisco, you mentioned Nick. Which
yeah.
So this is how many? This 48 pages. Explain to the audience, for those who don't know, what Lavender Godzilla is.
Well, we had GAPA had the Asian Pacific Alliance had a monthly monthly newsletter, but for a period of time we had a quarterly sort of arts culture magazine, and so there was a smut issue. There was one on homelands. There was one on immigration. That George Choi's on the cover. So there were quite a number of them, and they have been scanned, by the way, so they are available. to take a look at. Yeah, this is all from the early to mid 90s.
Right. So I want to highlight that it's not about love. Love is important, but it's not about love. It's not even about sex. It's about smut.
Yes, exactly. Smut.
I
That was the
wonder
idea.
if someone from the audience, I can look at the chat list right now because
Yep.
I'm doing this. But like, if someone on the audience is going to explain some of the decision around calling this,
Yeah, Prescott is on. Prescott is on. He can explain it.
and then there's a letter from Joelle to the editor, whatever, like pleading for some organized sex retreat or something. Yeah. So not to have sex, but maybe talk about it, write about it, whatever. Maybe, I don't know. So there's a lot of creative fiction, maybe nonfiction too. But then it's also matched with a lot of really graphic pictures.
Yeah.
What was the response when, like?
Well, I think it was generally positive. I don't remember anyone, asking for their money back or anything, although I could be wrong. It wasn't, I think Richard Fung's movie had come out and we'd seen the campaign in LA, but, there wasn't much. And it was still that time period. I was trying to remember, we had the 5 Gs, right? The 5 classical Hollywood roles. That I remember. Gook, Geek, Geisha, Gangster, Gardener. But then somebody came up with the 4 S's. I think they were smooth, submissive, what were the other 2? Short, something like that, which were the stereotypes of Asian men during that time period. And I think thus, we were trying to break that stereotype.
I love it. Boredom is always counter-revolutionary. I love that.
Prescott, he has to tell us who we can credit for that.
So there's some graphic stuff. It's graphic, right? Here's the bondage shot.
I think that's probably Freddie.
Yeah.
Freddie liked that.
But it's a celebration of kink. It's not even just like sex is important, but it's
all forms.
Right. And to me, and I think my friends, I think one of my friends who was an AIDS worker at the time said, like, it's like things like that makes you feel like, yeah, I could be a freak, I could be deviant, and I don't deserve to die. I still deserve to be in the community. I still deserve like healthcare, right?
Oh, sure. And I think part of it is, it's not that we thought everybody should do that, but I think you're trying to expand the space of what's possible, right? So, you don't have to do that, but to conceive of it, as a possibility. That's, I think, what we didn't see in not only mainstream media, but even, GLBT mainstream media. And the early stuff we saw, you sort of have to create your own at the beginning, right? One of the good or bad things is eventually it became commercial. So there were things that, for example, that the Asian groups would do early on. I remember dances, GAPA would do a lot of dances because a lot of people wanted to, go to places to dance with other gay Asians. And sometime in the mid 90s, they stopped doing that well because there were other commercial venues. So that's the one, things change and there are transitions. One of the negative things, I think, of the commercialization was that there was commercialization and that left, less space, I think, for non-commercial ventures. But there's always room. I think there was always non-commercial areas, and eventually that was more zine-like. And I think now, I'm already in my 50s, so old fogey. But young people now, we had zines, they have websites, and they have tweets, and they have apps. So it's good. Things chug along, things change. And this too shall pass, as it were. There's my COVID-related content for today.
Prescott just wrote, smut is a great dirty word and better than porn.
I think they're both good, smut and porn. We're going to have to do, I think we should do an entire web presentation on Lavender Godzilla magazines, or maybe just one on smut itself.
I mean, it was influential for sure. I think Vince mentioned Justin Chen. And
yes, Justin was part of it, no? Yeah.
These publications, right? And he was a performance artist who like put it all out there. I think Alice Hom remember the story of how she watched Justin Chen perform at Highways in Santa Monica, maybe, where he was like bleeding and drinking his own blood. Just to make a point about the self-aids and the transmission and all of that. So there's just a lot of like people have to be in your face because otherwise you're not going to get people's attention. Yeah. Is that why?
Yeah. Well, yes and no. I mean, the best publicity is good publicity, and the worst publicity is no publicity, right? I would think, I would think there should be a whole range of things. So it's always good to have some cutting edge, because it moves. It's sort of when you can broaden the entire sphere, it moves. It expands the center. It moves the center to some extent, and that was kind of the hope. I didn't think that, I don't think we expected every Asian person to get into kink or anything. But again, it was good to have that possibility for people who wanted it, and not to feel like they were alone or stigmatized about it. Yeah.
Vince Chrysostome said there was conflict because some of us wanted to be smutty.
Smuttier. Oh.
It's never too late, Vince.
See, from my perspective, my name is on there on the business side. So the big issue for me was that the board was concerned because of the cost. It was really beautiful, heavy stock, large, I think 11 by 17 cut down. And an issue cost something like $2,500 or something, which was a lot of money in the 90s. And I remember my recommendation was to go to legal size, fold it in half, 8.5 by 14 to save some money. So I think we could cut an issue cost down to $1,200 or something from $2,500.
Yeah. And I was going to share this too, and it happens in other communities as well. It's just not the API communities. Hold on, I'm having
Zoom issues?
Not issues, just clumsiness. So this is
Marlon. Tongues Untied, yeah.
Tongues Untied, which are also very influential for me. Just being able to see other communities where in this case, like celebrating Black love.
Had you seen Richard's movie Looking for My Penis?
I read the essay. I didn't see.
Oh, okay, Richard. Yeah, the movie was a little hard. This was pre-internet, obviously.
Right.
It was hard to get. I think I had a VHS copy or something.
Right. Yeah. So there's a lot of showing pride in who you are as a racial person, like your racial identity through expressing love with people from your own community. Right?
Again, a lot of people I see on this list will remember the entire sticky things. And if I recall correctly, Prescott, I'm shouting out to you, was a little controversial because I think at a certain point he would talk about intentionally not sleeping with non people of color. Is that a way of putting it? And that was considered very controversial at the time.
Someone raised their hand.
Oh, raise their hand.
Jem? Sorry, I just noticed. I apologize if you've been doing it for a while.
Jem from DC.
Jem Doss?
That's what I'm assuming it is. Is that Jem? I don't see a photo or a video, so I can't tell.
Yeah. So, Lee, can you?
Oh, Jem. He says I didn't mean to. It's all right. I've done that by mistake also. Hi, Jem.
Yeah, we would actually love to hear from folks who. I feel like there are so many people in this group, in the audience, that could speak volumes about what was going on at that time. Like, I have just one other question about, like, what do we take from this period, right, in the current moment? We can talk about that later. I don't want to get there yet because I'm having too much fun right now. But I want to see if there's anyone else who wants to share, too. They were sharing on the comment.
Yeah, let us know because Lee can unmute you. We can see you then.
No?
No? Steve, are you there? We're trying to get Steve Liu on the panel. But he promised he'd be on, at least as a participant. No, maybe he had something else.
Well, let me ask you this, Daniel.
Oh, okay.
People are still start thinking about what they're going to share, because I'm sure a couple of them will. What happened to that period? Like, how did the transition?
Well, it's funny. Some people, I talk to some old timers and they're like, "Oh, that was a golden period of GAPA or something." I don't think of it that way. I think there was a particular historical time period, I think, where a lot of us came of age. AIDS hit. We had some history behind us, and this is the sort of the way I think, and that we sort of stood on the shoulders of giants. I always joke that there's this sort of golden decade, usually about 25 to 35, at least in the old days, after you left school and were beginning a job, but before you sort of got into a serious relationship. I remember calling someone once about joining GAPA or rejoining, and they said, "Oh, I don't need to. I just got married," kind of thing. So I think there were a number of us. There was sort of a critical mass doing that, 90s, 2000s, that were in that, that time period that had been trained outside of the formal health, masters in public health or master in social work, and said, well, of course, we also were, we thought, oh, we'll come in, we'll fix it, we'll fix AIDS, and then we'll go back to our lives. That's at least my attitude at the very beginning, right? In the early 90s. I thought, well, we'll fix this. Or if we can't, I remember having a conversation with Raphael Chang in the 90s after I first started, and he said, if of all this prevention effort fails, right? Because we were trying it out, but we didn't actually know, right? Was this going to work? We'd have to wait a few years to find out. If this all fails, and we, haven't changed people's behavior, we're just going to have to move all the money to care, right? We're going to have this huge caseload, move all the money to care and prevention. So that was sort of the pessimistic possibility. So I think, so long answer, but I think, every generation, they're doing their own thing, and I don't think it's necessarily better or worse. People say, oh, now young people they don't remember the work we did, and I think, well, isn't that what we wanted? We wanted people not to have to go through what we had to go through, because they would have their own challenges and their own thing, their own issues to deal with. So I try not to be bitter.
Well, it was a great period. When I talk to folks that I interviewed, I don't think people realize how much that period meant to me and people in my generation. I get chills just trying to talk about this. It saved me not only from having like HIV prevention, it just saved me in a way that allow me to be myself, right? And it's not necessarily just the smutty side, although there's
all the sides. Yeah, that was what we were hoping, right? It would expand the possibilities again of what you could do, what you could be. Right. That you could be GLBT and you could be Asian Pacific Islander, you could be lots of things, but none of those things would define you, right? That was a point, at least to me, that was a point.
Yeah, and I think that's tremendously, like, it's not something that I felt like could be easily done by other movements, right? Yeah,
you got to do it for yourself, as it were. Yeah.
Right. Vince mentioned something. Do you know these folks that he mentioned, Daniel?
Oh yeah, Sienna Stewart, Lonnie. Yeah, the Safer Sex Sluts, of course. It was a sort of a safer sex troupe that came out of the GCHIP, which became Living Well Project, which became API Wellness Center, which has now merged to become San Francisco Community Health Clinic. So you see the time period, and they really talked about themselves as safer sex sluts, right? So they were, especially in the bi and the lesbian community, and that was something also that you didn't see much of. There was a stereotype that lesbians weren't affected by HIV, that they may be alcoholic, but they would sort of settle down and quote unquote be safe because they were monogamous. And we also wanted to expand that possibility for lesbian and bi women, that they could do also lots of things and not have to be narrowly constrained to a particular stereotype.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, thanks for that.
right. Yeah, that's true. It was the first women's safer sex initiative, Vince wrote. And I think there were also parallel that were happening in the lesbian community, the Asian lesbian community too, right? So this sort of sex positive trend. Yeah. So that was part of that. The safer sex sluts was part of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so.
What about you, Eric? You should answer your own question.
What was the question again?
What have we learned from that time period?
So this is what I have learned from that time period, right? Like, it's actually wonderful to be doing this history after the first book, and I realized, shit, like I put a lot of stuff in the first book without thinking how people are going to read it, and I'm glad, and I think I was able to do that. By the way, it's not autobiographical. I mean, when I put a lot,
do you have to say that to people? By the way, it's not autobiographical.
autobiographical.
That's always a novelist's problem, right?
I tell people it's 100% truth, but 10% facts.
Okay,
So
that's a good answer.
In that way, but I think personally, it sort of allowed me to just say fuck it, you know. And people would deal with what they would deal with, and also being in this, feeling safe, you know, with the community that I've created, knowing that I'm not only freak.
There's a community of you. You're not alone.
I mean, the novel is not that freaky. I don't think it's that freaky, despite what I shared at the beginning of the hour. The sex, it kind of got really more about like dealing with addiction, and then also caregiving for older adults, for the parents. That was my anxiety too. So there's this thing.
We've become that generation, right? A little bit of the sandwich generation, right, parents and kids. Not something that I expected.
Yeah, I'm not going to write a book about like 20-something coming out of it. I mean,
you could. Why not?
Well,
that's for the autobiography.
Yeah,
just the right amount of nipple. I think
it's disguised in fiction. It's only going to be like 10% fact.
Well, you know, I mean, you're a little young to write the autobiography, so you might have to wait a few years.
But I would say that for about a year and then some, a little bit over a year, on and off, I was in a BDSM relationship. And I felt like I could do that because of all the things that like allow me to explore, right? And that actually would be part of the next book. I didn't touch.
Oh, nice.
Like now that I see this connection, it's like, oh, I can go deeper. I can go slutty, or smuttier.
Well, you know, one of the funny things is a few years ago, I became the bookkeeper at Folsom. And, you know, I'm like the most boring vanilla person out there. But they're like, that's also a kink. I'm like, good. As somebody once told me, I can't remember who it was, you're always a virgin. There's always something you haven't done yet, right? So the funny things, of course, I'm the person who doesn't get distracted at the office. I'm like, I'm just trying to balance the books, you know?
So I mean, that's the personal impact on me. I'll talk about the movement lessons that I'm drawing from this in a little bit. But I just want to let people know that we are taking questions. You don't
questions.
You can
answers from you too. If you'd like to give an answer, let us know.
Share your story. It's all about storytelling tonight.
Yeah, Lee can put you on. You know, voice only if you want.
Yeah, raise your hand. You know. We all have pandemic.
Oh, there's Willie. Hi, Willie.
Does Willie want to speak? Oh, he just made the comment. Okay.
Oh, okay.
So the AIDS movement is interesting to me because it's a movement based on pleasure, and there are not too many social movements that are based on pleasure. I felt like a lot of social movements, at least in the U.S. context, is about labor, right? Which is important because it's a huge problem. It's some of it based on race. But I always say, like, people in the I'll use this example. My friend Linda Merriam wrote a book about the Manongs, and talked about sort of the masculine culture of the Manongs, right? And she looked at them not as only laborers, but which is how we define them,
Mm-hmm.
who they were. But we define them as laborers because it benefits us too, right? To have analysis, class analysis, which is also important. But I love the way she talked about that generation as someone with agency, right? That they delighted in expressing themselves through fashion, through watching boxing fights, through dancing with white women. There's a lot of pleasure. And I felt if we viewed a part of that generation, that I felt like it's not often talked about, right? That these people have agencies, right? So it's not reducing them to sort of their heart. Like when you ask them, like they probably don't want to identify themselves as farm workers, right? This is sort of our label that was imposed on them in some way for that class analysis. So the AIDS movement is interesting to me because it is about pleasure. It's about, and it opens up all kinds of implications for me, right? So, I mean, even like.
But was it about pleasure, or did we make it about that? I mean, to some extent, other people might argue it was about life and death, right?
Yeah.
And that we turned it into something that was about pleasure, rather than in the positive way. It didn't have to be about pleasure, right?
I'm glad
an abstinence movement.
Right? It's a choice. I think that's really even more beautiful. It's a choice, right? That we could have just retreated and say, we should not have deviant sex. We should all just put our condom and shut up, right? But we didn't do that. We should boring sex. At least you have your life. Because some people have done that. Some people have done that, right? And I'm glad we did. For the most part, or at least the part that I'm glomming onto, are not about that. It's about this. You can express whoever the hell you are, right? Mm-hmm. So that's really important to me. The other part is that I thought was interesting is you guys did not pick the easiest battle. This is not a story about picking the lowest hanging fruit.
It's funny you should mention that. Somebody once asked me a few years ago, why do you do what you do? And I realized, my answer, I think many of you have probably heard it, was that, I think there are a lot of very important causes in the world, fighting forest fires, saving kids, to me, they're morally equal. They're all important. The difference is, you have 10 million people that want to fight forest fires or climate change. But in those days, you had very few people who wanted to engage in work or engage in AIDS work. Right. And to me, 1 out of 1,000 could do more than 1 out of 1,000,000, And obviously there was more stigma, and this I will attribute a bit to being a little bit unusual, I don't think we mentioned it, but I was born in Argentina, when I moved here. And part of the work I did, I think sometimes was I could assume a more sort of Argentine Latino kind of personality in my mind, and do things that I think nice Chinese boys wouldn't necessarily do.
Yeah.
And so to me, it is about, again, if all these things are morally equal, do the least popular thing.
Yeah.
And
it's traumatic. I mean, the activists were advocating for people with HIV, which is probably one of the most stigmatized population at that time. I mean, even now, but at that time, when you imagine, having to talk about sex, safer sex, gay sex, having to talk about death in immigrant communities, having to go into rooms and people don't want you to be in the rooms, right? And
there was an old joke, what's the most difficult job in the world? It's selling life insurance to Chinese people. It's like, I can't talk about it. It'll happen,
And it's dealing with grief, that your friends are dying, your loved ones are dying, dealing with the sort of the trauma and while doing all of that. And I think the result of that is it's not just the people with HIV, living with HIV are the ones who are benefiting from it. People like me also benefited from it because in some way it's so weird because in some way it's very deviant, but in some way kind of normalize homosexuality too, right? Or sexual orientation in some way. Like there's this sort of interesting, we're trying to negate the disease in a way, saying yeah, you don't have to be gay to get it, but in some way it is a very much a gay-centered, a queer-centered movement.
You don't have to be gay to be queer, right?
Well, I mean, I talk about we don't want to own the disease, but we want to own the movement, right? So, and people get testy when straight people. Sometimes when women also, we talk about sexism in the AIDS movement, right, and how women are treated in the AIDS movement too. People wonder what are you doing? This is not your movement. When that's anyway. So that's a little tangent, but we can talk about that too, the sexism in the AIDS movement. It's
Do
a
we
big,
have questions?
yeah.
Questions. Oh, there's a question. I see one.
Where's the question?
You have to click the Q&A box at the bottom. From
Q&A.
Edwin Ramoran. How do you feel intimacy and cruising will
Hi,
be for
Edwin.
you post-COVID? Oh, post-COVID. Oh, post-COVID already. Interesting question. That's a hard one.
So there was actually a another event like this, right? Maybe Lee can talk about this. I watched it on YouTube after it happened. That talked about pandemic sex.
Oh yeah, we did that. Yeah, we did one on pandemic sex. Yeah. Well, you know, like I think whenever there's a new situation, right? I mean, this is great for voyeurs and for exhibitionists, right? I'm very touchy-feely, as probably many of you know. So for me, it's hard, and a lot of people talk about that, you know, the touch aspect. But you know, I think it's also having studied, you know, public health and you know, plague, polio, SARS. I mean, this is not new in some AIDS. You know, I mean, it's different obviously in some ways, but you know, in the end, I think humans are still social animals. So this technology, you know, helps in some ways. I think it supplements and it helps, but in the end, people still. I mean, you know, you can have phone sex, you can have internet sex, you can have lots of different kind of sex. I think a lot of people will still like, you know, good old-fashioned sex too. Not to reify good old-fashioned sex, but try to keep all the possibilities open. But I think there's always harm reduction. In fact, when you mentioned that pandemic program, one person talked about, and actually some health departments have talked about creating a bubble, a social bubble, you know, choosing some sex partners to be in there, having a certain certain agreement within that. And I think that, you know, that's the same essentially as negotiating, polyamorous situations, right? Where you're trying to figure out what you're comfortable with, what your partners are comfortable with, what risk you're willing to take. You know, life is not all about safety.
Yeah. Mask is the new condom. Right. I mean, you know, you can enact a lot of sex scenarios, kinky sex scenario with masks too, right?
Some people, yes. Some people particularly like that. Patrick has a question. Can you talk about how mainstream LGBT and AIDS organizations in the late 90s and 2000s tried to move into POC space for funding? Yes. What do you think?
So let's set the context, right? So a lot of the, I would say, I'll speak for LA. Like a lot of the bigger organizations are white run, right? And they are bigger because they've been doing it longer, and I think they also got in a little bit earlier, and so they've been able to get funding. And you know, with some funding sources, once you get in, once you're in the door, you become like,
oh yeah,
let's give it to them. They'll figure it out.
Yeah, and that became an issue in particular when care money reached a certain level of professionalization, and if you didn't get into the door at a certain point, you were very unlikely to be able to get in.
Right. So then there's a lot more money in care than say prevention. So what happened is, and at the same time, the smaller, the ethnic-based organizations don't always have the credentials to do the direct services, right? So they don't necessarily have the people with the MSW who have the clinicians who can do mental health counseling. So it takes time to build that up. So in LA, that was interesting because this group of smaller organizations run by in communities of color, they kind of banded together and they kind of made, for the White Care Act, the county through a commission or through a council determined like different categories, right, to give money out to. So they advocated to create a capacity building category so that they would spend money to help these organizations build up, right? But also the demographic of the epidemic also changed around, what would you say, around like early 90s?
Yeah, early mid 90s maybe.
Some people say like has not changed. It's always that way. It's just that, you know, people who have access to healthcare got found out first, and those the white gay men. right? It's always really tough in communities of color. It's just that we didn't really dig deeper until much later. So anyway, but in official number, the demographics changed. So people who have no connection with these community of colors will start losing money, because now the request for proposals are asking, like, can you serve Latinos and African Americans, Indians, and trans folks, like, or in rural communities. And so all these things will start popping up, and so they have to adapt or die, really. So they kind of start going into the communities of color in sometimes very clumsy kind of way.
Well, definitely as the funding sort of funneled, when I first started working in the early to mid 90s with GCHIP, it was about starting organizations, getting them in so they could get prevention and care funding. And then eventually they had to make a decision, and they had to decide, even in San Francisco, right? The San Francisco model, lots of agencies, wasn't feasible over long term. And you could see that they would have to merger, and eventually organizations had to decide. And the logical thing was for the sort of Asian AIDS organizations, were they going to do AIDS work with non-Asians, or were they going to do non-AIDS work with Asians, right? In order to increase the funding pot. And you saw different approaches and different histories depending on what happened locally. Of the three major orgs in San Francisco, LA, New York, right? Only LA is still APIT. And that's complicated because they never actually, one of the issues with LA was that they never became their own 501c3, right? They're still part of SSG. Whereas Apache and API Wellness Center both merged and changed their names, actually.
Become a clinic.
Yeah, so they went that route, right? To do HIV work with non-Asians. But you had to do it because you had to reach a certain size. There are only so many EDs you want to pay, in the end.
Right. Yeah, so a lot of these AIDS organizations have become clinics to get that kind of funding to survive, or else to die.
I'm not sure if we answered Patrick's question, but yeah, that was it's always an issue, right?
Right.
About space and who controls it and who owns it and who has a right to it, and
Rick Parrish talked about after he left APIT, one of the co-founders, Rick Parrish, went to work for Shanti, which is HIV. They provide emotional support for people with HIV and AIDS, and didn't have a lot of experience.
Well, they pre-existed AIDS.
Yeah. Even though it's a Sanskrit word, but they really don't have any experience serving people of color. And he said that he was brought on explicitly to be that connection to in this case, the African American community, because Rick is both Filipino and African American. And he remembered trying to do stuff at Watts, and which scared the hell out of the staff.
I mean, it's a tough situation because on the one hand, you want more services and more support, but then you also want, sort of local control, and so it's a tough balance. Are you going to tell the big organizations don't do it, right?
Right. And then
because at one point we spent our time telling the big organizations to do it, right? Not to tell them. Yeah, so it's a tough one.
So this is to answer your earlier question. So this was gossip, right?
Oh, okay, gossip.
Well, it's not like salacious gossip, but
okay.
I was talking
That's
to
the best kind.
The CEO of Vienna Star for my project, and talked about the white-run organization tend to poach people of color from these small organizations. So once they got some experience, they'll get poached into bigger organizations, and then so this is how gossip becomes history.
You're seeing the sausage making, everybody. Here's the sausage making.
Then this is why archives are important. I'm all kind of plugs right now. And I actually found an old article from the 80s in LA Weekly in the One Archive down in Los Angeles that actually talked about that. There was one specific example how someone left another Latino AIDS organization to go work for the APLA, realized that he was just being used as a token, and talk about that. So I think that might be closer to what Patrick said. Yeah. So let's see. Lee said that we should pay a closer attention to time. I know Molly asked the question about talk about it, Eric. Molly is my friend from Cal State LA, professor of sociology and at Cal State LA. I think you're referring to the sexism piece. And there's just so many layers. I mean, the whole Tina Turner incident is one. It's fascinating, but it's also very complicated. I struggled with how to describe women. I decided not to call them allies, because to call them allies, it felt like that they were not part of the people who have been, you know, so, and definitely, so I decided to just like, they are co-conspirators in the movement. But there are stuff like, and it's no different from like sexism from gay men in general, right? So one of the women that I interviewed talked about like gay men would objectify her. Gay men would tell her how to dress, like the queer eye, you know, gay men will queer eye her basically. And she just found it kind of ironic, but people felt that, she said that people felt that it's not that serious because you're not in danger, you know, like they're not hitting on you. So I think there are different ways to justify the sexism, you know, so, but that actually one of the questions I often ask, like, how was it being a woman working in a very gay male dominated space, right? And then men talk about like sex acts a lot, which made some women, particularly lesbians, uncomfortable too, you know, stuff like that.
Yeah.
I don't know. Any other question? Yeah, Edwin said accomplices. It was Dana, not Molly. It was her partner who asked that question.
Oh, one in the chat, one in QA. Let's see. Oh, Cesar has a question. So with Swim and on the subject of sex and drug use, particularly meth, what is your knowledge, experience, or understanding of meth use in the queer API community? Reasons why some turn to meth? Was it widely used among queer APIs in SoCal and the Bay Area?
Is that the Q&A?
Yeah, it's in the Q&A. Yeah. It's a question from Cesar Calaves.
Was it widely? I don't have the stat, but I would say when I was using, I did meet a lot of APIs, different circles. I would say, you know, this is sort of my take on drug use. I didn't use it. I think there's this narrative, there's this very conventional narrative about people use drugs because they are depressed, because they are lonely, because they are not happy, because nothing is going on with their lives, right? I use drugs because it was, again, pleasurable. It get me in trouble sometimes, the pleasure part. But I want to be very honest about like the way that I would use meth is like if something great happened, especially at work, if I beat the deadline, I was like, I'm looking to score that night, right? I'm going to like build on that, right? I don't know if you've seen this movie, 6 Degrees of Separation. It's a play before, but I saw the movie. I never seen the play. And Will Smith played a gay character in this movie, and so he kind of hustled into this upper Manhattan, like West Side, middle West Side, East Side. I'm bad with geography. So this white couple who is really rich, and he pretended to be one of their son's friend, right? And then so they took him in because he got stabbed. And then they took him in, they let him stay for the night. And then at night, while they went to bed, he went out to Central Park and picked up a hustler and bring it back home. And then they discover it in the morning. Towards the end of the movie, the wife asked him, like, why did you do that? Like, why are you trying to humiliate us, right? And he's like, it's nothing to do with you. I just have a great night with you. I want to add to it by having sex. That's sort of my approach to drugs in some way. It's just enhance the sex. I don't think I was depressed. I definitely was, things were going well, at work and even in my friend circle. But I felt like we need to talk honestly about why people use drugs. Otherwise, we keep throwing these messages that it's not, people not going to hear, right? And I think that's the parallel between HIV and AIDS. You have to think about the messages. You can't just keep telling people not to have sex when you know that's not going to be reality. Right? You have to acknowledge that people are sexual beings.
Yeah, And that I think human beings, like altered states of consciousness, little kids like to get dizzy. There is a reason for that. We just want to give people information, parameters, at least I want to, for harm reduction, so they can make informed choices. And I've actually never used meth, so can't.
Don't start.
No personal experience with it, and
It's the worst. I mean, it was great, but it was the worst in terms of getting. It's very addictive. Yeah. Don't start.
Statistics show that, yes.
I just discredit my own going to telling people not
to.
Your experience is your experience, Eric.
Yeah, we can talk about that. It's a longer conversation.
On that note, it's 7:30.
Yeah, it's 7:30. So unfortunately, we're gonna have to wrap up. If anybody has any other questions, we can maybe take one more. I did want to say, on this string of harm reduction discussion, we will be doing a. Eric mentioned a little bit ago that we're doing a series called Fighting Back. We're talking about lessons from AIDS for COVID-19, and we're going to be doing one in I think 3 weeks. It's going to be June 3rd will be one on harm reduction and how we manage risk while also meeting social needs, and the parallels that we can draw between harm reduction and safer sex to what we're dealing with COVID right now. So if you are interested in furthering that conversation, please feel free to join us. You can go to GLBT Historical Society or glbthistory.org/events, and you'll be able to see that coming up. And yeah.
Can I have a quick plug?
Yes, go for the plug.
The excerpt that I shared about Wake Parish is actually one of the podcast episodes that we are doing as part of this history that I'm gathering. One of our benefactor is also in the audience, so I want to give a shout out to Robert too.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was really helpful. So the Rick's episode is not out yet, so you were actually getting a preview of that episode. But the first episode, it's on the website now. It's also available in Spotify, and I put the link in the chat. It's apaitonline.org and then /sexpositive. So we'll be releasing the episodes every 2-3 weeks or so.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, for participating. Thank you, Eric and Daniel, for such a wonderful conversation. It was really fun to join you tonight. And everybody stay safe, stay healthy, and wash your hands.
Night. Good night.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Lee.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Lee.
That was fun.